Town. Thank you so much. Love it. So our speaker today, let me introduce you. I think you know him. You probably may even have talked with him, but I want to give you a little bit of background about him. Lee Valentine has been a member of SLCA for the past 12 years. Since wandering into the rich auditorium at the Woodruff Arts Center in 2005, he has served our spiritual community in a variety of ways. These include a 4-year term on the board of trustees, with the last 2 years being the president of the board. He led the effort to implement Fellowship One, which all of you know about that because you sign into that, and that keeps track of all your donations throughout the year. So he helped us find that and helped us get us set up. Excuse me, he is presently serving on the Building Search Committee with myself and Linda Schmar. So he's also eager to serve and always there for this community. An engineer by education, Lee graduated from the United States Air Force Academy and spent 11 years in active duty in the Air Force. Since then, he has worked as a management consultant in various industries, and he has been self-employed for 15 of the last 20 years. Oops, I lost my page. Bear with me. There it is. Lee enjoys being a student of New Thought, and although he does not hold any formal certifications from CSL, he does consider himself a practitioner, and so do we. He teaches through his daily interaction with all those around him, and we are better for it. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please help me welcome Lee Valentine.
Thank you, David. I'm happy to see that so many of you braved the aftermath of Snowmageddon 2.0 to come experience more of SLCA 2.0. Although I have to admit, I think now that we've gone from 2 services to 1, I think we should start referring to ourselves as SLCA 2.1. And perhaps when we move into our new space, that can then be SLCA 2.2 as we just continue the transformation. So the title of my talk this morning is, What Are You Doing Here? And there's a reason why I chose that. I chose that because I'm sure that many of you are sitting there right now asking yourself that question of me. As David said, I've been a member of SLCA for 12 years, and most of you I either know personally or you've seen me here many times. But typically when you see me here, I'm over there, right in that chair, right there, because I'm very much a creature of habit. And even when you see me here making an announcement about something like Fellowship One, board member elections, or perhaps the building committee. So, what am I doing here? Well, my spiritual journey is probably one that many of you could identify with. From my start as a child in church, trying to stay awake on a Sunday morning, to young adulthood, when I would sometimes introduce myself as a recovering Episcopalian. And roll the clock forward to about maybe 12 or 15 years ago, I was playing in a recreational basketball league at Dunwoody United Methodist Church. And being a church league, it was customary for the players of both teams to join hands and gather at center court before each game, and one of the members of the team would lead the group in prayer. So after one of my games one night, I was on the phone talking with one of my good friends who's visiting from Chicago. He's in the back of the room this morning, my brother from another mother. And I happened to mention to him that I led the prayer before the game that night. And his response was, "So, did your hair burst into flames?" And just to show that his sense of humor has not changed over the years, yesterday morning he sent me a text message. And he said, "Lee, when I woke up and looked outside and saw the blanket of snow and ice covering the ground, I thought to myself, Lee should have known that hell would freeze over before he delivered his message." So he obviously knows me very well. So he knows why I'm here. But for those of you who don't know me quite as well, you may be asking yourself, what are you doing here? Although some of you may be saying, what are you doing here? And others might phrase the question, what are you doing here? And others still might say, what are you doing here? Because obviously, because of the nuances and subtleties of the English language, depending on what word you emphasize in that question or in that statement, the question can take on a entirely different meaning. but I'm going to cover all of the bases this morning. Actually, I'm going to take that simple phrase and deconstruct it, and I'm going to spend just a few minutes on each one of those 5 words, analyzing it from the context of my spiritual journey and yours. Now, those of you who are familiar with our teaching know that your spiritual journey is much more than what takes place here on a Sunday morning, much more than what you engage in one of your spiritual practices, such as meditation or affirmative prayer, which we also refer to as spiritual mind treatment. I've heard the quote here at SLCA and other places many times that says, "You're not a human being in search of a spiritual experience. You're a spiritual being immersed in a human experience." And last month, Reverend David took that quote one step further when he said, "We are all spiritual beings engaged in a spiritual experience." So what this implies is that every hour, minute, second of our day and of our experience, whether that be a spiritual experience or a human experience, it's an integral part of our spiritual journey. And unlike a physical journey where we're traveling to a specific place, a spiritual journey does not have a destination. It's not like we say, okay, once I achieve eternal peace, then my spiritual journey will be done. It's all about the trip itself. And so the purpose of a spiritual journey is not so much to find answers, rather it is to continually ask questions. And one of those questions we can ask of ourselves is, what are you doing here? And I'm actually going to cover each of those 5 words in reverse order, and I'm going to need a little congregation participation to help me out. I've got some signs that I'm going to hold up, and all I need you to do when you see the sign is to just read out loud enthusiastically whatever it is you hear or whatever it is you see on the sign. You can pretend like you're in the studio audience at Family Feud. So let's give that a try. What are you doing here? I heard a speaker tell a story several years ago that puts the concept or the idea of being here or really anywhere in a unique perspective. This particular speaker said he was walking down the street one day and there was another gentleman walking several feet in front of him. And as they approached an apartment building, there was a second floor balcony, and there was another young man standing on the balcony of this apartment building. And the 2 other gentlemen, the one walking in front and the one on the balcony, obviously knew each other because the one on the balcony yelled down to the man in front. He said, "Hey man, where are you going?" And the man in front turned and said, "Nowhere." To which the man on the balcony replied, "Hold up, I'll go with you." So hopefully the concept of going nowhere is not one that would appeal to many of you, particularly as it applies to our spiritual journey. Because even though we're not traveling to a specific destination, we always like to think that we're making progress, whether it be to a higher level of awareness, more enlightenment, or even a higher level of consciousness. And in that context, if you ask yourself, what are you doing here? It naturally implies that what's most important is what's going on right here where we are today. Not what's going on across town at our friend's house, not what's going on across the country at our parents' house, and not even what's going on next door where perhaps our spouse or significant other might happen to be at the time. And I'll also add that what's most important is not what's going on in Atlanta City Hall, not what's going on in Puerto Rico or Southern California, not what's going on in North Korea, and not even what's going on in the White House. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't care about what's going on in those other places, whether they be near or far. Quite the contrary, we should care very much. However, what's most important to us is how we choose to respond to those various events. Whether it's a natural disaster where we can choose to respond through monetary donations or volunteering our time, or whether it's a relationship that's in need of healing where we can offer forgiveness or perhaps affirmative prayer. So the question is, what are we doing here, and what can we be doing here right where we are? And you have no direct control over the events that are taking place at these other, or that are occurring at these various places near and far, but we can choose how we respond to those events right here, with here being in our hearts, in our minds, and in our hands. And for me, another example that illustrated the concept of being here took place just last year. I attended a basketball game at Georgia Tech in Midtown. with a friend of mine. And we drove separately, and we parked on a surface lot off of 10th Street across the connector from the arena. And after the game, we were walking back to our cars along 10th Street, and we came upon a man in a sleeping bag on the sidewalk. And I mean, he was literally in the middle of the sidewalk on 10th Street, and we practically had to step over him to get by. As we passed the man by, my friend and I had a conversation about what we had just witnessed. And his take on the situation was, we didn't know that man's story. We didn't know about some of the decisions he had made, some of the choices that he had made earlier in his life that had taken him to that place. And my response was, you're right, we don't know anything about that man's past. We don't know, and we could certainly judge him, and we could say, well, perhaps if he had studied harder in school, or perhaps if he had chosen not to use illegal drugs as a young man, his life would have taken him to another place. However, I can guarantee you that the bottom line for him, the only place that mattered was right there, which was on the sidewalk on 10th Street at the middle of the night, where he was going to be spending the night. So when we think about the concept of being here, we can think about it from a literal or physical sense, such as what are we doing right here in this space where we are, or we can think about it from a figurative sense, meaning what are we doing on our path towards enlightenment, what are we doing on our spiritual journey. What are you here? Now, I probably could have structured my whole talk around this one word. There are just so many references, both contemporary and archaic, that I could make to this particular word. And I'll start with the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, which begins, as I'm sure you're aware, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Doesn't say in the beginning God thought about creating the heavens and the earth and decided that's too much work, so I think I'll start with the heavens and then see how it goes from there. Or Nike, just do it. Not just ruminate and cogitate on it for a while and then see how things work out. Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Not the journey of 1,000 miles begins with careful deliberation of what the journey really means. W. Clement Stone, whatever man can conceive, he can achieve. Not whatever man can conceive, he can probably get around to doing if he can clear enough time in his calendar with all the other obligations that he has. And finally, one that we hear in New Thought all the time, treat and move your feet. Not treat and take a nice long nap, and when you wake up, see if you have enough energy to move your feet. Although this morning we found a new variation of that. Eat or treat and then eat. Yeah. So this concept was also covered by Mary Morrissey in a Prosperity Plus class that I had the opportunity to take here at SLCA earlier this year. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it because it's actually one of our most popular offerings. And during when Mary talks about the concept of prosperity, she speaks to it not just from the perspective of financial prosperity, but also our health, our relationships, and our creative expression through our life's work. And in one of the videotape lectures that makes up the class, Mary led us to an exercise where she asked us to create a vision, to create and document, articulate a vision for the life we wanted to live, for the dream that we wanted to achieve. And the next thing she said we should do is live our life as if. Live our life as if we have achieved that dream. And one example I can share that illustrates this point comes from our own recently departed and beloved Lane Morgan. Lane said that, and she told me this, or she gave me authorization to share this story with you, so I'm not divulging anything out of confidence. Lane said that years ago when she was here in Atlanta, she had a conversation with a practitioner, and she told the practitioner that she was lonely because she was not in a relationship at the time. And she went on to share with the practitioner that one of the times she felt most lonely was when she was returning from a business trip. So landing at the airport on a Thursday or Friday evening, and when the plane touched down, she would look around, and most of the people on the plane would be pulling out their phones, calling a loved one, calling a spouse, calling a significant other, saying, "Hey, I just landed, looking forward to being home and seeing you," or perhaps you can meet me at the terminal in 10 minutes, that type of thing. And the practitioner's suggestion to Lane was, okay, how about trying this? The next time you get back from a business trip, when the plane lands and you see all of these other people pulling out their phones, I want you to do the same thing. I want you to pull out your cell phone and pretend to have a conversation with a loved one. And so in that act, Lane was acting as if she had that loved one on the other end of the phone. But the key to remember here is that she was not just pretending. What she was really doing was practicing. She was practicing for that time when the universe brought her companion, brought her significant other. And to hear Lane tell the story, it was literally just a few short months after that when she met the love of her life, now her wife, Becky Booth. So the implication here is that by living your life as if you have achieved your dream, that dream will manifest. And notice that I didn't say it may manifest, it could manifest, that dream will manifest. And this principle, which is summed up by the law of attraction, is a fundamental tenet of our teaching. It basically says you get what you pay attention to, or whatever it is you wish to experience more of in your life, do your best to demonstrate that you've already had that in abundance. But now what I'm going to say next is going to seem like a bit of a contradiction to some of the things I've just mentioned. Because what I've been talking about so far is taking action or doing something, engaging in some activity. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, what about my thoughts? What about my feelings? Aren't those just as important on my spiritual journey? And the answer is a resounding yes. And the answer to that question, or the basis for that, can be found in Dr. Ernest Holmes' description of the law of attraction in the science of mind. And I'm quoting from Dr. Holmes now. He says, thought can attract to us that which we first mentally embody, that which has become a part of our mental makeup, a part of our inner understanding. Every person is surrounded by a thought atmosphere. This mental atmosphere is the direct result of his conscious and unconscious thought, which in its turn becomes the direct reason for and cause of that which comes into his life. In other words, on our never-ending path of spiritual awareness, we acknowledge the importance of our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. And we even recite that as part of our declaration of principle here each Sunday morning when we say that all thought is creative and how I choose to think creates my personal experience. And actually, I would have put those words, what are you thinking here, what are you feeling here, but I couldn't hold up six signs at one time. So when you ask yourself the question, what are you doing here, that actually includes your thoughts, your feelings, as well as your actions. So, what are you doing here? Now, when we hear a practitioner, just as we heard Dietra this morning lead off in affirmative prayer, most often he or she will start with the words, as Dietra did this morning, something along the lines of, I'm going to recite these words in first person, but I invite you to take them as your own. What I'm going to say is, I'm going to recite these words in third person, and I invite you to hold up a mirror and ask this question of yourself. But again, if we ask that question, what are you doing here, from the context of our spiritual journey, would it make sense, or would it even be logical to say, you know, what is my boss doing here? If he just paid me what I was worth, then I'd be further along on my spiritual journey. I wouldn't have to be worrying about all this stuff. Or what are my parents doing here? If they had just taught me, or done a better job of taught me or teaching me how to have more self-esteem when I was a child, then I wouldn't have to worry about where I was on my spiritual journey, and I wouldn't be such a failure. Or what is my spouse doing here? If she would just give me more love and affection, then I'd have a happier marriage, and it wouldn't matter where I was on my spiritual journey. So unfortunately, no matter how tempting it is to project our feelings of unworthiness on someone or something else, intuitively know that we bear responsibility for our own awareness, our own enlightenment, our own mindfulness, and no one else. Now, we've heard a lot about Reverend David's mentor, Louise Hay, since she made her transition in August of this year. And the book that put her on the map, so to speak, was entitled, You Can Heal Your Life. And I'm sure many of you have that on your bookshelf today, and I'm sure you've read it for yourself. She was actually 58 years old when she wrote that, and it went on to sell over 40 million copies worldwide. Can you imagine how many copies that book would have sold if it had been entitled, You Can Heal Your Husband's Life? or perhaps you can heal your mother's life. Although I don't know if the original one sold 40 million, those might have sold 50 million. But once again, I'm going to take you down a path that's going to seem a little bit contradictory to this argument. I've been saying up to now that what's most important is what you are doing, how you are feeling, how you are thinking, not someone else, not those around you, not those who have come before you, not those who will come after you. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, wait a minute, aren't we all connected? And again, the answer is a resounding yes. And one of the other fundamental principles of our teaching is the concept of oneness. There's no us and them because we are all connected. We are all part of the divine. And again, this is also contained within our declaration of principle when we state each Sunday, I believe in the unity of all life. Now, while Dr. Ernest Holmes formulates a scientific argument to support this principle in Science of Mind, there was another article by an author named Nanette Littlestone in a recent edition of Conscious Life Journal that does a great job of articulating it. In that article, she wrote, not only does the familiar phrase, we are all energy, hold true, but the energy that flows through us, between us, among us, and around us binds us to every other living thing. At the heart of it all is a oneness, a connectedness, not just to other humans, but to plants and trees, birds, animals, insects, the oceans, even the very ground we stand on. Everything that we do, think, and feel becomes part of the part of the fabric of our environment, the people around us, the community we live in, and so on. So even though we're all connected vibrationally and energetically, I can still only control my thoughts, my feelings, and my actions. So when we ask the question, what are you doing here, we can only focus on ourselves. And I can even speak to the idea of oneness by using the theme for this month, which is integrity. Now, the most common definition of the word integrity references words like honesty, morals, and ethics. But there's another version of the word integrity that basically means the state of being whole and undivided, such as if we said the country maintained its territorial integrity over the course of several civil wars. So using this month's theme, we can say that we strive to maintain integrity or a unified state between our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. And if we can attain this unified state, we will guarantee our progression on our spiritual path. What are you doing here? This is as opposed to asking, what were you doing here last week or last month, or what will you be doing here tomorrow or next year? And that brings up another fundamental principle of our teaching, which is the concept of time. And Jack Kornfield, a best-selling author and Buddhist teacher, described it this way. He said, when we let go of our battles and open our heart to things as they are, then we come to rest in the present moment. This is the beginning and the end of spiritual practice. Only in this moment can we discover that which is timeless. Only here can we find the love that we seek. Love in the past is simply memory. Love in the future is fantasy. He went on to say, each morning we are born again. What we do today is what matters most. But where we get into trouble sometimes is where we think we have more time. And one story I'll share with you is a few months ago, one of my former coworkers made his transition after a 10-year battle with kidney cancer. And although his name was David, and although I had not seen David for several years prior to his passing, it was apparent from reading his obituary and listening to some of the remarks that were made by friends and family at his memorial service that he lived a very full and vibrant life up until the day he made his transition. And I was sharing that story with one of our mutual coworkers named Debbie, who did not attend the memorial service. So I was giving her some of the details, and her response was, yeah, it's amazing what you can do when you know you're going to die. I had this quizzical look on my face, and my response was, Debbie, I'm not sure what program you're on, but I know I'm going to die. I'm not sure when, not sure how, but I know it's coming. And just like David, after his initial diagnosis and subsequent treatments, he didn't know how long he had. It could have been a year, it could have been 20 years, but I'm pretty confident that at the end of each day, he was pretty comfortable or had the satisfaction of knowing that he got the most out of that one day. Are you doing here? Now, I don't have children, but believe it or not, I was a child at one point in my life. I'll have to admit, it was a fleeting period. I made a very brief transition from infant to young adult in just a few short years. But for those of you who are parents, I'll paint this picture. You catch your child engaged in some form of mischief or mayhem, and you ask them, "What are you doing?" What's the one-word response that you typically get? Nothing. So I have a story to relate from my brief childhood that will kind of illustrate this point. One Saturday, I went out and bought 3 or 4 boxes of poppers. I'm not sure if they still sell these, but they're basically kiddie fireworks that consist of a little twisted paper bud. At the end of the bud, it has just some little rocks and a small amount of what I assume is gunpowder. And if you throw them down firmly on a hard surface, they make a sound that's more like a snap than a pop. And the poppers, they came in boxes about the size of like an individual serving size box of cereal. And they were packed very loosely with sawdust to prevent them from igniting during shipment and handling. Well, I'd gone out that Saturday afternoon and bought 3 or 4 boxes of these poppers. And I'll have to admit, even as a young child, I had a propensity for things being organized and orderly. I guess that was part of my soon-to-be engineering career. So I was in my room that night and had the brilliant idea of consolidating the contents of my 4 boxes of poppers. So I carefully emptied out the contents on the desk in my room, and I carefully, one by one, placed a single popper into one of the empty boxes until I got to the end, and I had to force the last one into what was now a bulging box. And at that moment, I came to know that while a single popper, when it ignites, makes a sound like that, the contents of 3 or 4 boxes of poppers, when they ignite simultaneously, makes a sound something like boom. And my father happened to be asleep in the next room at the time, and he banged on the wall. He said, "What are you doing in there?" And of course, my answer was nothing. Although actually, I think my answer was nothing. So whatever it is I was doing at that time, it certainly wasn't nothing. And I'm of the opinion that there is no point on our spiritual journey where we can truly say that we're doing nothing. One of the other points that Mary Morrissey made in her Prosperity Plus class was that each of us will co-create the life we live with the universe. It's not that we can co-create the life that we live or we may co-create the life that we live. We will co-create the life that we live with the universe. The only question is, will that be by default or will it be by design? If I say, okay, I wake up in the morning and I pull the covers over my head and I say, I can't face the world today. That's fine, but the world is going to go on by default. And I'm going to co-create that day with the universe by default. So if I'm due to be at work at 9 o'clock that morning and I don't show up around 10 or 10:30, my boss is going to be calling me, asking me where I am, and I'm going to have to deal with those ramifications. But this only speaks to that one mundane aspect of my life. So if I want to create that day by design, then I will set my alarm, I will get up, get dressed for work, and arrange to arrive at work in time for my 9 o'clock show time, so to speak. But if we want to co-create our life by design, then what that means is I will know exactly what I want, I will have a plan to get there, and I will implement actions to fulfill that plan. And it's really another example of the law of cause and effect in action. So from the standpoint of our path of spiritual growth, there's no way for us to do nothing. every action that we take, every thought that we harbor, every feeling that we have carries some influence, no matter how small, on the outcome. And I'd like to close with one final story that caused me to ask myself, what are you doing here? Several months ago, I attended service at CSL West Georgia in Douglasville for the very first time. And actually, our own Dana Robinson was the guest speaker that morning. After service, I decided to run a couple of errands, and one of the stops that I made was my favorite store, Dollar Tree. So as I'm walking up to the store, I look to my left, and there's a young lady with a little boy, maybe 3 or 4 years old, who's walking in from the parking lot. So I instinctively go to the door, hold it open, and allow them to pass through. And when the little boy and the young lady passed through, she said nothing. And obviously, I had an expectation at that moment that she would have somehow acknowledged my good deed, if only with a simple thank you. And after I entered the store, I literally stood there for a minute thinking, what should I do? I said, well, maybe I should turn this into a teachable moment for her. I could approach her and say, excuse me, young lady, but I'm not sure if you realize it's considered polite to acknowledge when someone does a good deed, such as hold the door open for you. And I'm sure the expectation I would have had at that moment was she would say, oh, thank you, wise one. I am so enamored by your vast knowledge. I will do my best to impart that knowledge on the little one as he grows older, and we will both be forever indebted to you. And my only regret is I don't have a lamb to offer you in sacrifice. And I'd say, so thoughts like this were rolling through my head for a couple of minutes while I was there in the store. And eventually I said, okay, drop it. It's not that important. Let me just get my peanut M&Ms and graham crackers and get out of here. And Dawn, I'm sorry you had to find out that way about... I was hoping I could tell you that face to face. But... So a few minutes later, I'm at the checkout stand with my 13 items. And I pay for them, and as I'm walking out the store, I look to my left, and to my horror, there is the young lady and the little boy leaving the other checkout stand. So here was my moment of truth. Was this a sign that the universe and Miss Manners was giving me that I should truly make this into a teachable moment? So in that split second, I considered my options. Should I kneel down and pretend to tie my shoe? Although that would have been kind of tough because I was wearing loafers at the time. Should I make a dash for the door so I get out first and don't have to, or didn't have to hold the door open for them? Or maybe I could walk very slowly and walk behind them and see if she would hold the door open for me. And luckily for me, for her, and for the universe, I asked myself, what are you doing here? So at that moment, I released all of those thoughts, because obviously whatever it was I was doing there at that moment, I was not being kind, I was not being compassionate, I was not being mindful, so I let it go. I walked towards the door, I held it open for her so the little boy and the woman could pass through. And the best part about it for me was, in that moment, I released any attachment or any expectation I had for anything in return. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and I did it because it's what I wanted to do. But, you know, the happiest ending to that story is when the lady walked out, she turned to me and she said, thank you. Now, in closing, several weeks ago, I was having a conversation with Gregory Sheets, one of our long-term members, in between services, and Gregory, or I shared with Gregory that I was going to be delivering the message this Sunday, and he asked me a very thought-provoking question. He said, well, you know, Lee, what was it that prompted you to, you know, volunteer for that assignment? And I told him, you know, I'd been thinking about it for a while, but I never really, you know, stopped to think about, you know, my motivation. And he said, well, obviously, you know, you must have something that you want to share with the other members. And that was when kind of the light bulb went off for me. So what am I doing here? Hopefully what I have been doing here this morning over the last 25 or 30 minutes is sharing with you just a few insights from my spiritual journey, most of which have taken place and resulted from experiences that I've had with many of you here at SLCA. And as you approach the rest of your Sunday and the rest of the upcoming week and beyond, I encourage you to say those 5 simple words to yourself, and maybe even write them on a sticky and make them part of your spiritual practice. What are you doing here? Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Alt, and I simply want to say thanks. Thanks for taking the time to watch our broadcast here at Spiritual Living Center of Atlanta. We have a vision, and that vision is to reawaken all to their spiritual magnificence. And one of the ways that we are able to do that is through this very medium of broadcasting. So if you got anything out of this, if you felt in any way inspired, or if something spoke to you directly, then I extend an invitation to you to become a part of our family by donating. And there are many ways in order for you to be able to do that. One is to simply go to our website at slca.com, and there you will find all different kinds of prompts that will help you support what it is that we are doing here in Atlanta. One way is to become a pledger. That means that you decide on a monthly basis that you are going to help us with this vision. Another way is to donate through our management system called Fellowship One, another through PayPal, and another even easier way is on your cell phone. You can do what's called text to tithe, and that number is 404-796-7030. Again, thank you so much for your support, and I invite you to come back weekly to see what it is that we're up to. Blessings.